I never planned to go back. For 18 months, I told myself I wasn't ready. The lake house had been my wife's place long before it was ever mine. She'd inherited it from her parents, spent every summer of her childhood there, and in 41 years of marriage, she had never once let a single August pass without us sitting on that back porch together, watching the sun go down over the water. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to walk through that door. I couldn't bring myself to even look at photographs of it. But my attorney kept calling. He said I needed to make a decision. The property taxes were due, the insurance had lapsed, and if I didn't do something soon, the county would start sending notices. He wasn't being unkind, he was being practical. And at 63 years old, standing alone in a kitchen that still smelled faintly like the lavender candles my wife used to burn, I finally accepted that practical was all I had left. I told him I'd drive up on a Friday, 3 hours north into the hill country of Tennessee, past the gas station with the broken sign, left at the old feed store, and down the gravel road that always made my truck rattle like it was falling apart. I told myself I would spend one weekend, assess what needed fixing, and call a realtor on Monday morning. Clean, simple, done. I was not prepared for what I found when I got there. The front porch looked exactly as I remembered, same wooden railing my wife had painted white 3 summers before she passed, same rusted wind chime she'd picked up at a craft fair in Gatlinburg. But the flower beds along the front walk, which I had fully expected to be dead and overgrown after a year and a half of neglect, were trimmed. Not just surviving trimmed. The rose bushes she had planted the first year we bought the place had been cut back properly, the way she always insisted on doing it in early spring. The grass was mowed. Someone had edged along the stone path. I sat in my truck for a long time before I got out. I told myself it was probably a neighbor. Old Earl Hutchins lived about a mile down the road and had always kept an eye on the place when we weren't there. Maybe he'd taken it upon himself to do some upkeep. It was the kind of thing Earl would do. I talked myself into that explanation the entire walk to the front door. Then I put my key in the lock and realized it turned too easily. The deadbolt had been rekeyed. My key still worked, but something felt different, looser, smoother, like a lock that had been opened and closed dozens of times recently rather than sitting untouched for 18 months. I pushed the door open and stood in the entryway. The house smelled like coffee. Not old coffee. Not the ghost of coffee from a year and a half ago. Fresh coffee, the kind of smell that hangs in a kitchen when someone brewed a pot that morning and didn't quite finish it. I stood perfectly still and listened. No sounds, no movement, just the creak of the floorboards under my own weight and the distant knock of the water heater in the utility closet doing whatever old water heaters do. I walked through the living room slowly. The furniture was exactly where my wife had arranged it, but the throw blanket on the armchair, the blue one her mother had knitted, was folded differently than she ever folded it. She always folded it lengthwise and draped it over the left arm. This one was folded into a square and laid flat on the seat cushion. A small thing. But I noticed it. In the kitchen, the dish rack had 2 mugs in it, washed and drying. I opened the refrigerator and found half a gallon of 2% milk with a sell-by date of the following Tuesday, a carton of eggs, some lunch meat, and a 6-pack of beer missing 3 cans. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My second thought was that whoever had broken in wasn't treating it like a break-in. They were treating it like home. I pulled out my phone and called the local sheriff's non-emergency line. While I waited on hold, I walked down the hallway to the back bedroom, the one my wife had always called the guest room, but that we both knew she kept exactly the way she wanted it, with her grandmother's quilt on the bed and a little reading chair in the corner where she used to sit with her mystery novels on rainy afternoons. The quilt was there, but the reading chair had been pushed aside, and in its place, someone had set up a small folding table with a laptop charging cable snaking across the floor to the outlet near the baseboard. No laptop, just the cable, and on the nightstand, a men's watch I had never seen before, and a paperback thriller I had definitely never bought. I hung up with the sheriff's line before anyone answered, because right then, I remembered the cameras. My wife had been the one to insist on installing them, 4 years before she passed. I had thought it was unnecessary. We were only there a few months out of the year, and nobody had ever bothered the place in all the time we'd owned it. But she was firm about it. She'd read something in the news about vacation properties being targeted, and she wanted peace of mind. We had a small system installed. 1 camera covering the front door, one covering the back porch and the dock, one in the main living area, and one in the hallway. All of it feeding to a cloud account I had set up on her laptop and then completely forgotten about. The account was still active. I had been paying the subscription fee automatically for 18 months without once thinking to check it. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled up the app on my phone with shaking hands, and started going back through the footage. What I saw over the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I understood about the last year and a half of my life. I need to back up and tell you about my son-in-law. My wife had a daughter from her first marriage, a girl named Rennie, who had been 12 years old when my wife and I got together, and who I had raised as my own from that point forward. Rennie was 37 now, living in Nashville with her husband, a man named Douglas, who sold commercial real estate and had the kind of easy confidence that I had always found slightly too polished to fully trust. My wife had adored him. Rennie adored him. He was charming, generous at the right moments, remembered everyone's birthday, and could work a room the way very few people can. I had never been able to put my finger on exactly what bothered me about him. I felt guilty about that for years. My wife used to say I was too suspicious of people who made things look easy. She was probably right about a lot of things. What she didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Douglas had been in serious financial trouble for the better part of 3 years. I didn't know that yet when I was sitting at that kitchen table. What I saw on the camera footage first was simpler and more immediate. Douglas, letting himself in through the back door with a key I had never given him, on a Tuesday morning in March of the previous year, 6 months after my wife's funeral, while I was back home 3 hours south, barely able to get out of bed. He didn't act like a man who was doing something wrong. He walked in, set his bag down, opened the refrigerator like he owned the place, and made himself a sandwich. Then he sat at this exact kitchen table, opened a laptop, and worked for several hours before leaving the same way he came in. He came back 4 days later, and the time after that, and the time after that. By summer, he was coming 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes staying overnight. Sometimes he brought someone with him, not Rennie, a man I didn't recognize at first, heavy-set, always wearing a green jacket, who would spread papers and folders across the dining room table and talk on the phone in a low voice while Douglas typed. I watched maybe 20 minutes of footage before I had to stop and walk outside. I stood on the back porch where my wife and I had spent 41 August together, and I looked out at the water and I tried to think clearly. My son-in-law had been using this house, my wife's house, as some kind of private office for over a year, without ever asking, without ever mentioning it, while I was grieving 60 miles away, thinking I couldn't bear to come up here myself. The audacity of it was so complete that for a while I couldn't feel angry. I just felt like I was looking at something from very far away. Then I went back inside and kept watching. The man in the green jacket came up in my memory about 2 weeks into scrolling through the footage. I finally placed him in a clip from late September, when he turned directly toward the living room camera while arguing with Douglas about something I couldn't hear clearly. His name was Terrence. He was Douglas's business partner. I had met him once at a holiday party, briefly, a handshake and a forgotten conversation. Douglas had introduced him as his associate. What the two of them were apparently doing at my wife's lake house was running a side operation that Douglas's legitimate commercial real estate business was being used to funnel money through. I am not a financial expert, and I will not pretend I understood all of it, but what I saw in that footage was clear enough. Documents being printed and signed, cash being counted on my dining room table, a conversation in November where Terrence said loudly enough for the camera's microphone to pick up clearly. The account in your wife's name still has the routing number, right? Nobody's touched that? And Douglas said yes. I had to listen to that 3 times before I fully processed what I was hearing. My wife had maintained a separate savings account her entire life, something her father had set up for her when she was young, that she'd kept in just her name as a matter of personal principle. I knew it existed. I was not on it. After she passed, I had assumed it would be part of the estate proceedings, something the attorney would handle in due course. I had never thought about it again because I had never needed to. We were comfortable. I was not watching bank accounts. I called my attorney that afternoon from the back porch, keeping my voice low even though I was alone. He was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining what I'd found. Then he said, "Don't touch anything in that house. Don't confront anyone. And send me access to that camera system tonight." I asked him if he thought what I was describing was what I thought it was. He said, "I think you need to let me make some calls before you do anything else." I stayed at the lake house that night. I slept in the front bedroom, my bedroom, the one my wife and I had shared for the first time since her funeral. I lay there in the dark, listening to the water and thinking about Douglas at my kitchen table making himself a sandwich 6 months after we buried the woman who had welcomed him into this family. I thought about Rennie, who I had raised, who trusted this man completely. I thought about my wife, who had always told me I was too suspicious. In the morning, I drove into the nearest town and found a diner and drank coffee and waited for my attorney to call back. He called at 10:15. He had spoken to a forensic accountant who was a colleague of his, and he had also made a quiet call to someone he knew at the state attorney's office. He told me not to get ahead of myself, but he also told me that the account in my wife's name, which was legally part of her estate and therefore under my control as the surviving spouse, had not been dormant. There had been a series of small transfers in and out over the past 14 months, nothing large enough to trigger automatic flags, but consistent, regular, the kind of pattern that looks intentional when you know what you're looking for. Someone had been using my dead wife's bank account as a pass-through. And the only person outside of my attorney's office who had ever had access to those account numbers was Douglas, because my wife had listed him as an emergency contact on certain documents when Rennie had a minor medical situation 2 years before she passed. A one-time thing. A form that should have meant nothing. I want to tell you that at this point I was purely cold and strategic about what happened next. That I handled everything calmly and without emotion. But that would not be honest. I sat in that diner booth for 45 minutes after I hung up with my attorney, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the week my wife died. Not for the money, not even entirely for the betrayal. I cried because I had spent 18 months feeling guilty about not being strong enough to come back to this house, and the whole time Douglas had been up here helping himself to her things, to her accounts, to the home she loved, while I sat alone 60 miles south, drowning in grief. He had not just betrayed me. He had been doing it in her space. That is the part I could not forgive. My attorney's advice over the following 3 weeks was to be methodical. We documented everything from the camera system. The forensic accountant pulled together a full picture of the pass-through transactions. My attorney filed the appropriate reports with the State Financial Crimes Division and made contact with the federal side as well, because some of what Terrence had been doing crossed state lines. I did not call Douglas. I did not call Rennie, which was the hardest part. I spoke to my attorney every other day, and I went back to my regular life, and I waited. I should tell you something about waiting. At 63 years old, when you know something enormous is coming and you cannot say a word about it. Every time Rennie called me on a Sunday evening the way she always did, her voice cheerful, asking how I was eating and whether I'd made any decisions about the lake house, I had to sit with everything I knew and say nothing except that I was fine and I was thinking about it. Every time Douglas was in the background of one of those calls, saying hello in his easy way, I had to hear it and respond normally. It was the longest 3 weeks of my life after 18 of the hardest months of my life. The morning the investigators made contact with Douglas, I was sitting in my own living room and my phone rang and it was Rennie. Not a Sunday. Not her usual call time. Her voice was not cheerful. She said, "Dad, I need you to tell me what's happening. There are people at our door." I told her to let them in. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong and to cooperate with everything they asked. She started crying and asked me how long I had known. I told her 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How did you find out?" I told her about driving back to the lake house, about the cameras, about sitting at her mother's kitchen table watching a 1.5 years of footage on a phone screen. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Mom always said those cameras were a good idea." That is a sentence I have thought about every single day since. Douglas's situation unraveled quickly once the financial crimes investigators had the full picture. The side operation he and Terrence had been running was a layering scheme attached to several commercial property deals, not large enough to be front-page news, but serious enough that both of them were facing federal charges. The money that had moved through my wife's account was recoverable. My attorney handled the estate corrections and made sure everything was properly documented. Douglas and Rennie separated within 2 months. That was her decision, made clearly and without pressure from me. She told me she had suspected something was wrong for longer than she wanted to admit, and that the only thing she felt more than betrayed was furious at herself for not trusting that instinct sooner. I told her that was a thing her mother used to say too. that we do not always see clearly the people we have chosen to love, and that is not a failing of intelligence. It is just what love costs sometimes. She moved to a smaller place in Nashville. We talk on the phone most evenings now. She has started driving up to the lake house on weekends, which I would not have expected, but which makes a certain kind of sense. She told me she needed to reclaim it, to make it feel like her mother's place again instead of whatever it had become. I have been doing the same thing. I went back up there in the spring and spent 3 weeks doing repairs I had been putting off for years. I restained the back porch. I fixed the dock, which had 3 boards that had gone soft. I found the rusted wind chime on the porch and took it down, intending to throw it away, and then stood there holding it for about 10 minutes and hung it back up instead. One evening, I was sitting in the back bedroom, the room Douglas had been using as his private office, and I was looking at the empty space where the folding table had been, and I thought about what my wife would want done with this place. Not what I wanted, not what made practical sense, but what she would actually want. And I knew the answer without having to think very hard. She would want it used. She would want it full of people and noise and the smell of coffee in the morning. She would not want it to sit silent because the 2 of us were the only people who had ever truly known how to love it. So I made a decision. I reached out to a grief counseling nonprofit that operates in the region, an organization that runs weekend retreats for surviving spouses and parents who have lost children. I offered the lake house as a retreat space, 2 weekends a month, at no charge. The director called me back within an hour of receiving my letter, and I could hear in her voice that she had spent time with this kind of loss herself. The first retreat was in early June. I stayed away that weekend, at my own home, thinking I would feel strange about it. But instead, I felt something I had not expected and could not quite name at the time. I think the closest word I have for it is relieved. Like something that had been held at a particular tension for a long time had finally been allowed to ease. My wife put those cameras in because she wanted peace of mind, because she was the kind of person who paid attention, who noticed things, who believed that knowing the truth, even an uncomfortable truth, was always better than not knowing. She would have said that was just common sense. She said a lot of things that turned out to be common sense. What she could not have known is that those cameras would outlast her, that they would go on watching and recording for 18 months after she was gone, gathering evidence in the quiet of a house nobody was supposed to be in. Waiting for the morning, I finally walked back through the door and remembered to look. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife. I have watched a man I brought into my family dismantle something I could not protect. I have spent 18 months learning how grief can make you smaller than you are, and 3 weeks learning how anger, the right kind, focused, and patient, can make you larger than you thought possible. I do not believe that everything happens for a reason. I have lived too long to believe that. But I do believe that some things leave behind more than just loss. My wife left behind a home and a daughter and a set of cameras she installed on a Tuesday afternoon because she trusted her own instincts, and a bank account her father opened for her 60 years ago that turned out to matter one more time in ways neither of them could have imagined. She also left behind the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing someone for 41 years. The kind that tells you, when you're sitting on an empty back porch looking out at the water, whether you're making the right decision or the easy one. I try to listen to that voice. I don't always get it right, but I went back to that lake house. And what the cameras showed me gave me back something I thought was finished, not just justice, but the chance to turn a place full of ghosts back into a place full of light. If you are sitting somewhere right now listening to this, maybe it's early morning where you are, maybe it's late and you are in the middle of something you cannot yet see the end of, I want you to hear this. The thing that feels like it has been taken from you is not always gone. Sometimes it is just waiting. Waiting in a cloud account you forgot to cancel, in a house you couldn't bring yourself to go back to, in evidence that was gathering itself quietly while you were learning how to survive. You do not have to rush toward it, but do not let anyone convince you it isn't there. If this story stayed with you, I want to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe that justice, even when it arrives late, is still worth waiting for, you are exactly who this channel is for.